Do you have to be smart to be an engineer? A lot of people have made videos on this topic and they're not exactly honest. I want to be honest with you to prevent you from a lot of time wastage and immense suffering as somebody who has a bachelor's in chemical engineering from a pretty good school. It ranks around top 20 in the world. Uh, Short answer is yes. But I want to dive into it with some personal experience from my undergrad. And it's not even just yes. It's not even that, being smart is part of being an engineer. I want to say something very controversial, which is that it's pretty much all that matters I've found in my experience. Okay, before we start this, I already know some of you are high school students listening to this, and you're going to say, okay, no worries. Well, I'm smart, so this doesn't really affect me. Next, you might want to stop there for a second because you need to realize that high grades in high school and high grades in university, especially a STEM degree, from a good school, not from like a very low competitive college in the middle of nowhere, where if you go to some place like that, yeah, you can probably get good grades even through a bachelor's in engineering, just because everybody around you is so low IQ that it's just going to get scaled up. So as long as you're like slightly above average, you'll do well. I mean, from like a proper engineering school. To get good grades in like a good engineering university compared to high school is so day and night. I had a 95% average in high school. I was a top in every single class. Physics, chemistry, math, English. I had the highest grade in the entire class. When I got to engineering, my 95% went to 75%. That's a 20% drop. So if you're over there with, an 85%, which is almost an A, and you're saying, well, that makes me smart, think again. And the reason is high school tests memorization. University engineering courses test raw intelligence. Let me elaborate. In high school, you get problem sets. You memorize the steps to getting a solution for those problem sets. You then see the same questions on the exam, just slightly reframed, or sometimes the exact same question just with different values. And you're able to get the solution and get a high grade just by putting in effort. Well, that doesn't work in university because your problem sets and your exams have entirely different problems, and that's intentional. A lot of engineering students would complain when we would get these very difficult midterms and final exams, but I was like, well, that's the point. You're being trained to be an engineer. You need to actually be able to work in the field and encounter problems you don't know the solutions for and be able to solve them. So it's important that in our undergrad we're tested for that ability, and the people that can't do it are weeded out because they're not meant to be engineers. Their brain is just not wired that way. So that's the first thing. Doing well in engineering in university is about raw intelligence. It's about the ability to see a problem you've never seen before and to use your general intelligence to deduce a solution from your raw intuition, not by trying to remember a series of steps. Even if you can understand those steps, it's still not the same thing. In my undergrad, I had a roommate who was a genius, and he hardly. So actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example of two people I knew in my undergrad, and I'm going to contrast them just to show you how important intelligence is and getting through engineering in your grades. I had my roommate was so he was brilliant, and he was one of the laziest people I ever knew. He never studied. He was crammed the day before the exam, and he would go into the exam and he would get like a 90%. Never studied, would just watch YouTube all day, crams the day before the exam, gets 90%. Because he just had a really high IQ. And conversely, I knew another student, a friend of mine, who I don't know anybody that studied as much as him. He was always studying, and I knew that because he would always be in the study hall in our dormitory studying, and anytime he went there, he was there, and you could sit with him and study together. And I would look at his notes, and he would have the most comprehensive handwritten notes I've ever seen, just going through every single lecture slide the professor went through, going through every recommended textbook reading, going through every single problem set, going through problem sets from other schools, going through textbook problems, and he would go to the midterm and he would barely pass and fail sometimes. Well, he ended up switching to business because he realized no matter what he did, he just couldn't get through engineering. So I don't want that to be you because he put in a lot of time and suffering trying to be something he's not. Fortunately, he was poor enough at it to the point that he literally could not pass, so he was forced to switch majors. The worst case scenario is when you're actually able to just scrape by. Because there's some people that can just scrape by through an engineering degree. They put in a lot of grit and they're able to pass and get like that, C's get degrees. But what ends up happening is when they actually graduate with that piece of paper, they can't find a job because they're not actually qualified to be an engineer. They just barely scrape through it. And engineering, to actually perform as an engineer, you can't be right 55% of the time. So what ends up happening is these people, they end up having to go to different fields or they end up in technician roles because they try to be something or not. They were never meant to be an engineer. And what's interesting about engineering is that it's either you are wired to be an engineer, you have the intelligence, or you don't. But what universities do is to collect money and to sell you a dream. They allow people that they actually know have no chance at ever being engineers enter engineering programs, and they lie to these students and they throw enough freebies in the exams where these students are able to pass through as long as they're somewhat intelligent. But then these students, when they go out into the field, they realize that they're actually not competent enough to be an actual engineer because they don't have the ability to solve problems they haven't seen before. And that's all engineering is. Engineering is the ability to solve problems you haven't seen before. So then they complain that, degrees are worthless, even STEM degrees are worthless, the job market is so bad. It's not that. That's just projecting. You don't want to accept that it's you who is incompetent and not smart enough to be in this field. So you project out and say, oh, it's just the job market, it's tariffs, it's yada, yada, yada. And really, it's just you. People get engineering jobs with engineering degrees. I'm sure you know many people that did. You're just not in that boat of intelligence. And that's the other thing is how to recognize these incompetent people is they're also the people that tend to say, oh, I don't even use anything I learned in my engineering degree. I don't even use it. Yeah, because you don't actually have a proper engineering role at a design level. You're a glorified technician. All those differential equations, you actually do use them. You just don't use them when you're working as an operator or a technician. You use them when you're actually in a design role. When you're in a design role, when you're designing things, and you're designing, a structure or a circuit or, some sort of chemical processing unit, you're designing a distillation column from scratch, you have to use those equations. You have to use mass and energy balances, which are represented as differential equations. So my point is, take an IQ test. If you're not at least above 120, don't bother because you will be way better off going into a field where you are in the top 10%, you'll make way more money going into a field where you are in the top 10%, even if that field is deemed to be lower than an engineering field, than you will as a bottom 20% or 10% engineer. You know, literally, I'm not exaggerating. A top 10% electrician can go start their own company. They'll outperform all the other local electricians. They'll outbid them for contracts because they're just more competent. And they'll make way more money than if they tried to become an electrical engineer and they were a bottom 10% electrical engineer. A bottom of 10% electrical engineer is going to get some, even if they somehow do get a role, they're going to get some very bureaucratic paper pushing type of role where they barely make anything. So recognize what you're capable of, go into that field and excel in that field, and don't waste your life trying to be something you're not. Anyways, guys, thanks so much for listening. I'll see you next time.